About a couple years ago, a lot of us thought that a championship was miles away for the Ferrari team after what was a humiliating 2022 campaign. For the first time in a few years, they had a genuinely fast car and a car that probably could contend for the World Championship, yet threw it away in hilarious fashion, teeing up Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing into having quite a comfortable 2022 in the end. Things had to change fundamentally at the Ferrari team if they were going to challenge for a championship 2 or 3 years or even 4 or 5 years down the line. And that's exactly what happened going into 2023. Mattia Binotto was no more, thankfully, as the team boss of Ferrari, and in came Frederic Vasseur, an experienced team principal, and for Ferrari, the first team boss they had had since Jean Todt that was not an internal appointment. And thankfully for the Scuderia, Frederic actually had previous experience as a team principal, obviously being the team boss of Alfa Romeo / Sauber, and also for Renault as well, and was even team boss back in the early GP2 days. And by no coincidence, through decisions made by Frederic to reorganise the team, in just a couple years, Ferrari are much stronger, operationally are much better performing, and look quite likely to strongly contend for the 2025 championship. And if we look at the season we just finished a couple months ago, Ferrari at many points in the 2024 season illustrated why they very well could win both the Drivers' and the Constructors' Championship, as they impressively took the Constructors' Championship battle down to the final race despite not having the fastest car on the grid really at all through the 2024 season, and on the driver's side still put up a pretty good fight with Charles Leclerc despite again the performance of the car. The performance of the car, though, did get quite a bit better in the second half of the season, and certainly compared to main rivals Mercedes, McLaren and Red Bull, Ferrari ended the year quite strongly. And with the new superstar driver lineup of Charles Leclerc and your 7-times world champion Lewis Hamilton joining the team, Ferrari have a great chance in 2025. And in today's video, I'm going to get into how big Ferrari's chances are of actually winning a championship in 2025. The first it would be in 17 years for the Scuderia. We'll look at the car performance and how it evolved through 2024 and how it could benefit them in 2025. Also, of course, look at the driver lineup and how recent performance levels may help the team quite a lot. And look at, of course, how they will compare to their competition. And once we get to the end of the video, or near the end of the video, I will get into my prediction as to where Ferrari will actually end up, in my view, for 2025. But before we get into things, guys, make sure to smash a like button on this video as always, and let me know in the comment section down below what you think of Ferrari's chances in 2025, especially compared to their competition, and just in general, how do you think the 2025 championship battle is going to go? But let's start with the most important factor for Ferrari in 2025, if they are going to compete for any of the championships, and that is car performance. Something that wasn't always consistent through 2024, but again, the way they ended the season, if they were like that through the whole of the season, 2024 could have been quite a bit different for the Scuderia. And if they had not had that mid-season dip, probably win the Constructors' Championship. But how did Ferrari get to a point where their car is now so regularly competitive, not just for podiums for both cars, but even for race wins? Well, the story starts really in the winter of last year, so pretty much 12 months ago. At this time, 12 months ago, Ferrari were busy getting ready their 2024 machine, which they hoped to be a lot better than the 2023 car, which was bugged with a lot of issues. And the reason during 2023 they couldn't fix those issues immediately was because a lot of the problems with the 2023 car were fundamental and carried over from the Binotto era at Ferrari, as Binotto, despite being team principal, still had technical influence over the Ferrari car. And with then Frederick Vasseur coming into the team and the technical reorganisations that happened during 2023, there was nothing that could be done during that season, as I said earlier, to actually fix the car. So it was always going to be a wait until the start of 2024 to see if Ferrari had actually fixed those issues fundamentally. And they did. And immediately in pre-season testing, Ferrari could clearly see that the car was much quicker in all conditions, and especially when it came to drivability, the car was much better than its predecessor. The two drivers, Leclerc and Sainz, complained a lot in 2023 about the drivability and the consistency of the Ferrari car during stints, during qualifying laps, and that is something that fundamentally changed for 2024. And that's a big reason why they started 2024 for the first 5 to 6 races as probably the closest team to Red Bull, who at that point in 2024 still were clearly the best on the grid. They of course picked up a race win in Melbourne, Australia, even though probably didn't have the fastest car that weekend, but the results in those opening races represented a big improvement again because of the improvement of not just the downforce of the car, but again, drivability. At the very start of the European season, Ferrari continued to pick up good results, a podium at one of their home races at Imola, and then of course the race win in Monaco, where they were clearly the fastest team, getting both cars on the podium as well. And at this point, people were thinking Ferrari were, at least on the driver's side, legitimate contenders for the Drivers' Championship. Leclerc was not a million miles away from Max Verstappen, and Ferrari, even on the constructor's side, were not a million miles away from Red Bull. And Ferrari looked like they had really all the momentum to take it to Red Bull compared to other rivals like McLaren. This would be followed up by a disastrous Canadian Grand Prix, which wasn't really necessarily down to a bad upgrade or the car fundamentally just being bad. It was just a bad weekend and a bad track for their car. But the upgrade they would bring to the car a couple weeks later at the Spanish Grand Prix did make the car worse. Carlos Sainz, according to him, made the car a lot more bouncy at high speed, thus taking away the stability the car had in the opening quarter of the season, which meant in the high-speed corners in Barcelona and then later in the high-speed corners at Silverstone, they were seriously lagging behind McLaren, Red Bull, and even now Mercedes, and had the fourth best car at best. This issue, though, would be fixed eventually after we came back from the summer break. The high-speed bouncing went away. Ferrari brought a new big upgrade at their second home race of Monza, which coincidentally they went on to win. The win wasn't necessarily down to the upgrade. They weren't the fastest team at Monza, but the car was in all facets easier to drive and much faster than it was before. And further evidence that it was easier to drive than it was in the middle of the season was that Ferrari were now, during races, not falling away as dramatically as they were before in terms of being able to manage their tyres. And were actually managing their tyres the best in some races out of all of the teams. This continued really until the end of the season. There were a couple races still where Ferrari were having some tyre issues, Mexico being one with Leclerc, and also I think the Qatar Grand Prix, Ferrari's tyres weren't being managed that great there. But in most races, they were able to keep the tyres in good condition, something we had not seen with the previous couple Ferrari cars. And this is really what helped them win races, even though they weren't necessarily starting from pole position. A great example of that, of course, being the US Grand Prix, where in the race, magically were half a second a lap quicker than every other team and won the race comfortably and got a 1-2 as well. So the car that has finished 2024 is a car that is very much a drivable car, consistent car, manages its tyres well, doesn't necessarily have the greatest pace overall of all of the teams, but it is a very good car to drive. It's not like the 2022 Ferrari that was very fast in qualifying but killed its tyres in the race, or the 2023 Ferrari that maybe sometimes was very quick in qualifying, but undrivable at times on Sunday. It's a car that can put them in the mix for the top 3 positions on a Saturday, and then on a Sunday puts them right there in the mix for the race win most times. And to go with that, of course, they have, in terms of performance, the best power unit on the grid in the last year of these particular power units. So in terms of car performance, it couldn't really be any better for Ferrari. The only thing they can really get better at is fixing the general performance of the car. But in terms of, again, the drivability, the managing its tyres, and how the car feels generally, there isn't much to improve for Ferrari. But another thing that, of course, will help them enormously going with the car performance is the driver lineup they have. Monegasque star of Ferrari, Charles Leclerc, and joining the team for this year, Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion, but not necessarily performing at the level he was at before. We'll start with Leclerc though, and Leclerc, based on how he performed last year, is no doubt one of the best drivers on the grid. He is, at the moment, I would say, the closest driver to Max Verstappen in terms of not just speed, but consistency of that top level performance. If you compare him to other top drivers such as Lando Norris, maybe Lando Norris, you could argue, was more consistently quicker over a single lap. But on race day, Leclerc was at times, in terms of performance level, streets ahead of Lando. Not making, silly mistakes, getting the starts right, and having consistent levels of pace through the race as well. And getting, most importantly, the best out of his car. The only drivers I could think of in 2024 that were matching or better than Leclerc was Max Verstappen. Of course, I think he was the best driver of 2024 and is still going to be, obviously, the driver to beat in 2025. George Russell, I think you could argue, was very similar to Leclerc in terms of consistency and pace, and also the consistency of getting the best out of his machine. But compared to all the other, say, top drivers, your Hamiltons, Piastris, drivers like that, Lando Norris's that I just mentioned as well, I think based on current performance, he is one step ahead. Because as I've said, he's got the pace, but most importantly, he is showing it consistently. And if you look really since the beginning of this ground effect era, Leclerc has been consistently the closest driver in terms of performance level to Max Verstappen. If you go back and look at 2022, even though Leclerc, in a couple races did make a mistake or two, he was consistently the best driver outside of Max Verstappen. He put in some top performances, some excellent qualifying laps, and did give Max in certain races, until Ferrari fucked things up, quite a challenge. And if you were to ask Max who is the closest driver to him, I think he probably would say Leclerc, based on these last 2 or 3 seasons. Lando proved in 2024 that he's got the pace in qualifying, but hasn't got the performance level and consistency in the races. George Russell has not been consistently fighting at that level yet with a driver like Max Verstappen, so we can't tell at that championship level how Russell is going to perform. Oscar Piastri, same thing goes for him. Also, he's still developing. Lewis Hamilton has had a drop-off from last year, which we'll get into in a moment. So Leclerc is Ferrari's best hope. And you could say the grid's best hope of dethroning Max Verstappen in 2025, if given a good enough car. As for Lewis Hamilton, though, it is going to be a very interesting 2025, because the first thing to look out for is Hamilton back to the levels at least of 2022 or 2023? Never mind 2019 or 2020 when he was winning championships. If he is consistently operating at an elite level in 2025, then Ferrari have got a perfect situation of 2 absolute top drivers to take on Max Verstappen for the Drivers' Championship, and it would be fantastic for their Constructors' Championship effort. But also it is great with Lewis Hamilton to see him up against Charles Leclerc for 2025. Not that he hasn't had competition in the last couple of years with George Russell, he has, but Leclerc, I think, is just that slight bit better than Russell. Plus, it will give us a great indication as to whether Hamilton truly is back to his best, because if he starts the season a couple tenths of a second quicker than Leclerc in the first few races, how could anyone deny that Lewis Hamilton is back to his absolute peak? So it is crucial that he has that very good reference as a teammate. And another good thing for Lewis Hamilton is if he is getting back this year to his best, the first couple tracks we are going to this season are two circuits that he has been very, very quick around. Melbourne, Albert Park, of course, and the Shanghai circuit. If he is back to his best, he should be on top form at those tracks and should be, at minimum, a strong podium contender. And if he does start the season really strongly at those type of circuits, I can only see him continuing that, especially if the car has a lot more consistency of handling compared to the Mercedes car he had in 2024. Everyone could accept Lewis Hamilton was not quite good enough in 2024. Him getting beaten so heavily by George Russell, his teammate in qualifying, was, for him, unacceptable. But we also have to mention that his Mercedes car was not exactly handling in the way it was supposed to. He had lots of unusual oversteer moments, and there were certain race weekends where his car was literally undrivable. Still, yes, I get it, you still have to adapt and still deliver, but there were certain weekends where he just couldn't deliver, I think because those handling issues were so overwhelming for him to overcome. So if the Ferrari car at the start of 2025, which it should be, is consistent with its handling, very drivable, isn't giving him any major surprises, then in pre-season testing at least, that should help him build confidence going into those first couple races where, like I said, at circuits where he should show strong form. And as long as Ferrari have a car that is right there in terms of performance with McLaren and Red Bull, at least for the constructors side, they have got a very good chance of winning the Constructors' Championship. It would be their first Constructors' title in 17 years. For the driver's side, though, how is that going to fare for the Ferrari team? A lot of it does depend on car performance and just where they are at compared to McLaren and Red Bull and even Mercedes at the start of the season, I'm afraid. And of course, we don't know what the performance is right now, and we're going to have to wait until St. Patrick's weekend in Melbourne to truly find out who is where. If we look back, though, to the start of 2024 in terms of how much did the performance change from the end of 2023 to the start of 2024, given how the regulations over that winter were the same as they are pretty much now. If you look at the start of 2024 compared to the end of 2023, and I remember even saying it on a couple streams I did, the performance wasn't really that much different from the end of 23 going into 24. So if that is to be similar going into 2025, then it should be, say, McLaren maybe having the fastest car, and then at most Red Bull and Ferrari a couple tenths of a second off, or at least within a couple tenths of a second, with Mercedes in there in the odd race where their car suddenly starts to work. Spoiler alert, I don't think Mercedes are going to be in the championship battle. That's a prediction I made a couple months ago with this team. I just don't think this car fundamentally can be fixed enough to be a championship contender for 2025. And as has been pointed out before, they still have issues with correlation for the wind tunnel, as do Aston Martin. So yeah, Mercedes I just don't see as title contenders. I think they can win races, but I don't see them on the same level as Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull in terms of fighting for the championship. McLaren, you would think, would maintain the car they had at the end of last season, which again was the quickest, but not by that much. Lando Norris ended the season pretty fast, getting a lot of pole positions and was very quick generally in qualifying. Piastri didn't have a great final few races, had a couple decent, qualifyings at the end of 2024, but in general, after his win in Baku, it wasn't great for him. So the only thing Ferrari really have to fear with McLaren is not the driver lineup, it's the pace of the car. If Ferrari, though, can somehow start the year quicker than McLaren, then Ferrari should beat McLaren on a regular basis, because like I said, there's nothing to fear for their drivers compared to McLaren's drivers, because Ferrari, even though I like McLaren's driver lineup, Ferrari's is clearly better when it's at its best. The only concern with Ferrari I do have is, of course, the world champion Max Verstappen. And it's not necessarily Max Verstappen that is my concern, but it's Red Bull. Because if you go and look at the final 6 races of 2024, Red Bull were a lot quicker than they were in the middle of the season. We all accept in the middle of the season, Red Bull had a big drop-off in pace. Upgrades were not working on the car. They were making the car worse in terms of the handling. Eventually, they figured out the issues, brought an upgrade, and the car returned to being as quick as it was in May and June, where it was quick enough to get pole, quick enough to win races, but it just wasn't dominantly quick. That is my concern going into 2024, not just with Ferrari, but also McLaren, that if Red Bull continue with that type of car that they did have in those final 6 races, which again was good enough to get pole, good enough to win races, but just not dominantly, because they do have Max Verstappen, who is clearly the best driver on the grid, that if they start the year that way, Red Bull will only get better and will still be the clear favourites for the championship and still be, I'm afraid, hard to beat. But of course, we don't know officially how things are going to be performance-wise until, like I said, we get to Melbourne, which is in under a couple months from now. But if, again, the performance levels are similar in Melbourne to how they were at the end of 2024, I think Ferrari have got definitely a good chance at winning a championship in 2024. No doubt about it. Even if Lewis Hamilton isn't performing consistently every race, and let's say once every 3 races he's on the podium, which for him is not that great, considering just how great we know he can be. But let's say that's his level of consistency, and Leclerc is the one leading the team forward and is regularly on the podium and winning races, then I think Ferrari, as I said earlier, even if they don't have the fastest car overall for the year, on the constructor side, I think they've got at least, I would say, 30%, probably 40% even, chance of winning the championship. I really like their chances for the year. I will be doing a 2025 predictions video, probably soon before pre-season testing. Obviously, it will be based on just my predictions, based on really how 2024 went to a degree, and just how I think 2025 will go. And of course, won't be based on car performance because it will be coming out before pre-season testing. But if I was to do a quick spoiler with Ferrari, I think Ferrari will be very close to winning the Constructors' Championship. But ultimately, I'm going to say no to Ferrari actually winning a championship in 2025. Whilst I have said in this video, their chances are good, and they are. Even if I don't think they're going to win the championship, their chances are good. You cannot deny that. Ultimately, I just don't think they'll get the job done, and here's why. McLaren are going to start the year, I think, with fundamentally a better car, and because of how McLaren have developed their car over the last year or so, which has been very good, probably the best team on the grid in the last year or so at developing their car, if they continue that over 2025, which I think they will, and start the year with the best car, which I think most likely they will, even though it won't be by a massive distance, McLaren will have a more comfortable year than they had in 2024. So whilst it will yet again be close on the Constructors' Championship side, I still think McLaren will end up winning it because purely of the development race between McLaren and Ferrari, which McLaren, I don't think anyone can deny, have been better at than any team in the last probably 18 months. And then on the driver's side, again, it will be close. I think Leclerc will be closer to Max Verstappen in the championship than he was in 2024. But as I said earlier, because I think Red Bull will start the year with a type of car they ended 2024, which again was good enough to win races, wasn't dominant in the races they won, but still good enough to put Max Verstappen regularly up there where he needs to be. I think because of just how great Max Verstappen is and how consistent he is, especially consistent at getting the best result he can at pretty much every Grand Prix, that will allow Max Verstappen to win the 2025 championship. But it will be close, the Drivers' Championship, definitely, between, I imagine, Verstappen, Leclerc, Norris, maybe Lewis Hamilton as well, if he gets back to his best. But remember, guys, even though I don't ultimately think Ferrari will win the championship, it's irrelevant what I say at the moment, because my opinion is just my opinion based on, to a degree, what happened in 2024, but ultimately we don't know what the performance level of the cars are for 2025, and there is every chance I can be proven wrong. Personally, I don't think I will. I'm confident in my viewpoint, but I've been proven wrong before. I didn't think McLaren would win the championship in 2024. I don't think really anyone did, but they did. But the point of this video is that Ferrari, despite what I think will ultimately happen when we get to the end of 2025, Ferrari, without a doubt, have got a pretty good chance on both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship side of getting the job done on either side, or maybe even both championships could be won by the Scuderia this year. Something that hasn't happened in almost 20 years. And if it does happen, Ferrari will well and truly be back. But that's it for this video, guys. Again, let me know in the comments section, what do you think of Ferrari's chances for 2025? What do you think of the reasons I've given for their chances being good for the 2025 season? And ultimately, how do you think things will shake out championship-wise between what should be the three main contenders, Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari? And on the driver's side, again, how do you think things will shake out? And I'll have a look to see what you guys have to say in regards to that. But until my next video, guys, it has been me, ChazzaHD. Goodbye.